silence of the empath is not emptiness. It is thunder disguised as stillness, absence carrying the weight of centuries. When one who has borne the burdens of others withdraws, the void they leave behind is not hollow. It is a mirror. And those who once leaned upon their ceaseless giving suddenly confront a truth they had avoided. They were never in love with the person. They were in love with the function. This is why Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The empath's quiet exit is not fate. It is revelation. And for those accustomed to being carried, the revelation is devastating. If this speaks to your soul, stay until the end. You are not alone. Let the silence speak. Let the remembering begin. You sit before me, the empath, the one who has lived not as subject but as vessel. Jung described certain souls as possessing innate sensitiveness, a heightened receptivity to the psychic atmosphere around them. This capacity makes you permeable, porous, open not only to your own joys and sorrows, but to the sorrows of the collective. Like a mirror without silvering, you reflect everything yet remain unseen. You are the listener, the absorber, the one who carries others' shadows without name or acknowledgement. In Jungian terms, you have become entangled in what he called participation mystique, the unconscious merging of identities where boundaries between self and other dissolve. In this fusion, you take on the moods, projections, and unassimilated fragments of those around you. They deposit into you what they cannot bear to face within themselves. And because you have not yet differentiated, you accept this psychic debris as if it were your own. You become, as Jung observed in his Patience, a container for material disowned by others. This dynamic is not benign. It carries an unspoken contract. The terms are simple yet ruthless. I will carry your pain if you grant me love in return. The empath bargains unconsciously, believing usefulness will be exchanged for belonging. But as Jung warned, where love reigns, there is no will to power. And where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking. What masquerades as love is often dependency, manipulation, or unconscious exploitation. This is the tragedy of compassion, without boundary. Compassion is sacred, but when it dissolves the distinction between self and other, it ceases to be love and becomes martyrdom. To soothe every wound, to absorb every conflict, to silence one's own needs for the sake of another. This is not eros, not agape. It is servitude to the shadow of others, and it exacts a psychological toll so subtle and corrosive that one hardly notices until the soul itself begins to fracture. For years, perhaps decades, the empath moves silently through this cycle, absorbing, healing, soothing, without reciprocity. Their persona, the mask Jung said we all must wear to meet society, is shaped around being endlessly available. They become indispensable, but not known, useful, but not valued, nourishing, but not seen. The false self grows, while the authentic self recedes into exile. Jung taught that every sacrifice of one's own truth for the sake of another's comfort is a betrayal of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of realizing the self, which he called the totality of the psyche. The empath delays this process, clinging to the unconscious belief that love must be earned through suffering. Yet the self will not be silenced forever. One day, without fanfare, without rage, a voice arises from the depths. Ancient, quiet, relentless, it whispers, "Enough." This is the archetypal role of the empath, a figure at once luminous and wounded, a healer whose compassion has been weaponized against themselves, a vessel of projections, a bearer of shadows. Their life becomes a dance between sacrifice and awakening, silence and thunder. And when the moment comes that they heed the voice of the self, the contract dissolves, the persona cracks, and the empath's quiet exit begins, an act that will reverberate through every soul who once depended on their invisible labor. There is a moment when the empath's soul begins to stir. It is rarely accompanied by drama or rage. Instead, it is like the faint gray light before dawn, a subtle yet irrevocable shift. Something within begins to fracture the old arrangement. No longer can the empath betray their inner truth to sustain external harmony. Jung would describe this as the stirrings of individuation, the movement toward wholeness, toward the self, which is both center and circumference of the psyche. The mechanics of this quiet exit are not outwardly violent. They are subterranean. Jung wrote often of the underworld journey, of the necessity of descent. For the empath, this begins with a withdrawal of projections. What was once absorbed is now returned. What was once carried is laid down. They cease to mirror back what others cannot face. They no longer participate in the endless dance of unconscious merging. This is what Jung called the dissolution of participation mystique. The world misinterprets this movement. To those who relied upon the empath, the silence feels brutal, like abandonment. But silence is not absence. It is transformation. Jung observed that when one withdraws from compulsive enmeshment, the vacuum left behind magnifies hidden dynamics. The empath's stillness becomes a mirror. Those who once leaned unconsciously upon their endless accommodation now encounter themselves, raw, unbuffered, unsoftened. The imagery is archetypal, a descent into the basement, where for the first time one hears their own breathing. This is the underworld, the symbolic realm of shadow and forgotten fragments. Jung, steeped in alchemy, would name this the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution of the false structures that once held the psyche together. It is terrifying because it strips away illusion. Yet it is also sacred because only in this dissolution can the gold of the self emerge. Here the empath ceases to explain, ceases to apologize, ceases to rush in with rescue. They begin to ask questions never before permitted. What do I want? What do I love? Who am I when I am not useful? Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This is the moment of choice, though it often feels more like necessity. The soul will no longer permit self-abandonment. The quiet exit is not a single step, but a series of psychological movements. Boundaries appear where once there was only permeability. The empath begins to say no. They cease to cushion conflict. They become unavailable for the crises that once consumed them. They stop seeking approval for their choices. Each act of refusal is not cruelty, it is individuation. Each silence is not rejection, it is protection. And for those who benefited from the empath's sacrifice, this is experienced as rupture. Suddenly, the scaffolding of their emotional lives begins to crack. Their projections, once safely housed in another, return home. They must now face the shadow they disowned. This is the hidden brutality of the empath's exit, not in what the empath does, but in what they no longer prevent. The anesthesia has been withdrawn. The pain that was numbed by another's sacrifice now surges forth. Jung insisted that healing demands this confrontation. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. The empath's withdrawal forces this recognition. It is not vengeance. It is individuation in action. Thus, we arrive at the paradox. The empath's exit is the most brutal revenge precisely because it is not revenge at all. Jung taught that the unconscious will rule our lives until it is made conscious. The empath's absence strips away denial, forcing others to see the architecture of exploitation that once passed for relationship. Revenge, in its common meaning, is an act of ego, a retaliation, a will to inflict pain. But the empath's quiet exit is not born of the ego. It is born of the self. It is archetypal, not personal. When the empath ceases to perform the role of healer, of absorber, of savior, the unconscious contract dissolves. I will carry your pain if you grant me love. This spell is broken, and when it breaks, the edifice built upon it collapses. The devastation lies in the revelation. Suddenly, it becomes clear that what was mistaken for love was dependency, that what was called connection was in fact enmeshment, that what seemed like harmony was merely the silencing of one voice to amplify another. The absence of the empath's labor illuminates these dynamics more brutally than any accusation could. This is why silence is so potent. Jung understood silence not as passivity, but as transformation. In alchemy, the vessel must be sealed for the transmutation to occur. The empath's withdrawal is this sealing. No more explanations, no more defenses, no more pleading to be understood. The stillness itself becomes the teacher, the revealer, the mirror. Those left behind will often rage. They will say, "You have changed," to which the only truthful reply is, "Yes, thank God." They may accuse the empath of coldness, of selfishness, of betrayal. But as Jung noted, such accusations are projections. They reveal not the truth of the empath, but the unintegrated shadow of the accuser. What they call selfishness is in fact sovereignty. What they call cruelty is clarity. Others will attempt seduction, what modern language names hoovering, sudden promises, sudden affection, sudden recognition never offered before. Jung cautioned that where the will to power reigns, love is absent. These efforts are not reconciliation, but control disguised as care. They are attempts to restore the old contract, to rebind the empath into servitude. But the empath who has begun to awaken cannot return. They have tasted the bitter clarity of individuation, and it cannot be forgotten. The revelation burns away illusion. Love without reciprocity is martyrdom. Service without recognition is servitude. Silence without choice is not peace, but oppression. And here lies the paradoxical revenge. It is not inflicted, but revealed. Not enacted, but uncovered. The empath's absence forces others to confront the truth of their own psyche, their dependence, their projections. It is not the empath who wounds them. It is their own shadow, mirrored back with merciless clarity. This is why the quiet exit devastates. Not because it is loud, but because it is absolute. Not because it punishes, but because it reveals. The empath's quiet exit is not merely a change in behavior. It is a death, not the death of the body, but of the mask, the false self, what Jung called the persona. For years, perhaps for decades, the empath has lived inside a role, the agreeable one, the peacekeeper, the healer. This persona was not arbitrary. It was forged in early wounds, in childhood experiences where love was conditional upon usefulness. The child learned, if I soothe, I am safe. If I carry, I am wanted. If I disappear, I am loved. Thus the mask became second skin. So natural it seemed to be the self itself. But individuation requires rupture. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The mask must crack. And when it does, grief floods in. For the empath is not only leaving others behind, they are leaving behind the version of themselves who survived by erasure. This grief is often mistaken for loneliness, but it is deeper. It is mourning for the self that never had permission to exist. Every time the empath said yes when their body whispered no, a fragment was lost. Every time they offered comfort while their own heart ached, another piece was scattered. Jung called this fragmentation of the psyche a form of soul loss. Now, as the empath withdraws, these pieces return, but not without anguish. Here, the alchemical stage of Negrito fully unfolds. The blackening, the dissolution. Structures collapse. Relationships built on false identity fall away. Roles demanded by family or partners dissolve. Even the inner scaffolding of self-image disintegrates. The empath no longer knows who they are. They are no longer who they were, and not yet who they will become. Jung compared this to the descent into the underworld. Terrifying, disorienting, yet utterly necessary. Those who once depended upon the empath now panic. They say, "You've changed." They call them cold, selfish, hard. But what they mourn is not the person, it is the function, the invisible labor that made their own avoidance possible. Without it, they must face themselves, and so they rage. The empath feels this rage like arrows, but they no longer pierce. For something has shifted. Silence now speaks louder than justification. Clarity has replaced apology. The empath begins to understand the truth Jung emphasized. What others name cruelty is often only clarity. This death is not gentle. It feels like betrayal, both to others and to oneself. The nervous system, conditioned for years to equate suffering with home, now trembles in the emptiness of peace. The empath may long to return to chaos, not because it was healthy, but because it was familiar. Jung warned that the psyche resists transformation, preferring the prison of the known to the terror of the unknown. Yet there is no going back. The false self is ashes. The agreeable one has died. And from these ashes, something waits to rise. In alchemy, after the blackening comes the whitening and the reddening. After dissolution comes coagulation. Jung saw this not as mere metaphor, but as psychic reality. The process of integrating shadow, persona, and self into a living wholeness. For the empath, this next stage is the sacred return, the emergence of the sovereign soul. The sovereign empath is not hardened, but clarified, not closed, but whole. They still feel deeply, but no longer compulsively absorb. They still love, but without disappearing. Their boundaries, once invisible, now radiate as subtle but undeniable walls of energy. Those who once read them like a manual now find them unreadable. They are no longer a container for pain, but a vessel for beauty. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This is that privilege unfolding. The empath, once enslaved by projections, now embodies conscious empathy. Compassion is no longer currency. Help is no longer an addiction. Care no longer demands erasure. Their very frequency changes. Old bonds dissolve. People who once leaned upon them vanish. Those who only loved them, silent, drift away. And in their place, new connections appear. Ones built not on utility, but authenticity. At first, these feel strange. For so long, love was synonymous with effort, with exhaustion, with sacrifice. Now it feels like ease. The nervous system, unaccustomed to safety, wants to flee. But gradually, it learns the language of peace. This is the gold of alchemy, the transmutation of suffering into sovereignty. The empath who once fractured themselves to be loved now shines whole. Their silence is no longer absence, but presence. Their boundaries are not walls, but foundations. Their peace is not withdrawal, but flame. Jung taught that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The empath has descended. They have faced the underworld of their shadow, their contracts, their compulsions. They have died to the false self. Now they rise, not as savior, not as martyr, but as sovereign. This is the most brutal revenge, because it is not revenge at all. It is revelation. The empath's wholeness exposes others' fractures. Their clarity reveals others' illusions. Their sovereignty dismantles others' control. And nothing is more devastating than truth unveiled. The sovereign empath does not seek to punish. They simply live. And in their living, they embody the archetype of the self, radiant, rooted, indivisible. The empath's quiet exit is not vengeance. It is remembrance. Not punishment, but revelation. It is the soul, long fragmented, gathering itself into wholeness. Jung called this the privilege of a lifetime, to become who you truly are. And so, in the silence, a new life begins. Not built upon sacrifice, not chained to usefulness, not fractured by projections, but rooted in authenticity, nourished by truth, crowned in sovereignty. Those who once named your absence cruelty will never see that it was clarity. Those who called your peace betrayal will never understand it was protection. But you know, and knowing is enough. Let the absence speak. Let the silence flame. Let the remembering begin. This is not revenge. This is resonance. This is wholeness.